The gate had already slammed shut by the time the king's guards dragged the seventh handler out of the pen. His arm was limp at the wrong angle, bent somewhere between the elbow and the wrist in a way that made even the soldiers standing nearest look away. The courtyard fell so quiet that people could hear the low, steady growl still rolling from inside the enclosure, like thunder that refused to end. No one moved toward the gate. No one spoke. The king's head physician knelt over the fallen man, and the chief kennel master, Corvin, stood back with his arms folded, watching with his jaw set tight, and his face showing no feeling at all. 7 handlers in 6 weeks. That was the number being whispered from soldier to stable boy across the whole of Aldenmore that morning. 7 grown men, all chosen for their size and experience, all carried out of that same pen on stretchers or between 2 pairs of arms. And the 3 wolves still paced inside, untouched, untamed, and utterly unwilling to allow any human hand within reach. They had arrived at the palace 40 days ago, aboard a ship from the Eastern Empire, a gift from Emperor Darren to King Aldric, to mark 20 years of peace between their 2 kingdoms. The Emperor's letter had called them royal war wolves, trained under the hand of his finest keeper for 7 years. The letter said they were loyal beyond any creature Aldric would find in his own lands. The letter said they answered only to the commands of those they trusted. What the letter did not say, what no one had managed to discover yet, was what made them trust at all. Corvin had tried everything he knew. He had tried slow introductions through a barrier, letting the wolves smell gloved hands from a distance. He had tried withholding food until the animals were hungry enough to take it from a stranger. He had tried bringing the palace's oldest and most respected hound trainer, a man called Edgar, who had been working with dogs since before most people in that courtyard were born. Edgar spent exactly 1 afternoon in the pen before the gray female knocked him flat and left 3 long gashes across his shoulder. Edgar had not returned. The wolves themselves were not small. They were not the sleek, elegant animals people imagined when they heard the word wolf. These 3 were massive. The largest, the black male the handlers had taken to calling the Shadow, stood nearly as tall as a young pony at the shoulder. His head was broad, his eyes were pale yellow, and when he turned that gaze on a person, it did not feel like being looked at by an animal. It felt like being measured. The gray female was leaner, faster, with dark markings around her eyes that made her look permanently alert. The third, the youngest, moved differently from the other 2, a slight hesitation in his back right leg that no one had yet gotten close enough to examine. Aldric was not a patient man by nature. He had governed Aldenmore for 18 years, and his kingdom had prospered under him because he made fast decisions and held to them. But this situation was moving past the point where fast decisions helped. The Emperor's envoy was sailing toward Aldenmore right now. The man would arrive in less than 30 days, and he would expect to see the gift his emperor had sent being honored, well housed, and properly managed. What he would instead find, if things continued this way, was 3 powerful wolves living in a stone pen, being feared by every person in the palace. That was not the image of a kingdom that deserved continued friendship with the Empire. Corvin stepped forward and cleared his throat. He was a tall man, gray at the temples, with the particular kind of confidence that comes from decades of being the most knowledgeable person in a room. He had managed the royal kennels for 14 years, and had never lost control of an animal for longer than a few days. This situation was, in his own private judgment, an embarrassment. He told the king that the animals were likely suffering from the stress of the voyage and the grief of losing their original keeper, a man named Old Bram, who had died during the sea crossing before the ship even reached Aldenmore's harbor. He said he believed another week of patient work would produce results. He said this with great confidence, the way he said most things, and Aldric listened with the polished stillness of a man who has learned not to show when he is losing his patience. Aldric looked at the handler still being tended on the ground. Then he looked at the pen gate. Then he looked at Corvin. He gave Corvin 10 more days. If the wolves could not be approached, handled, and shown at least basic responsiveness by then, he would have no choice. He could not send the Emperor's animals back across the sea without causing a serious insult. But he also could not allow 3 creatures to injure his staff indefinitely. If they could not be reached, they would be put to rest quietly, and an explanation would be offered to the envoy. That was the word he used. Put to rest. Quiet enough. Final enough. Corvin nodded and said he understood. The crowd around the courtyard began to loosen and drift away. The physician helped the handler to his feet, or tried to. The man had to be carried in the end. Marin had been standing near the far wall of the courtyard, beside a row of wooden water buckets she had been refilling when the shouting started. She was 19 years old, the youngest worker in the palace kennels, and her job on most days involved scrubbing floors, hauling feed, filling water troughs, and doing whatever task the senior handlers did not want. She had been working in the kennels for just over 2 years, ever since her father, a butcher in the lower town, had put in a word with a contact who knew one of the stable overseers. She had no formal training. She had no title. She owned one good pair of boots and kept a coil of plain hemp rope on a peg above her sleeping mat because she used it every morning to manage the larger hounds when the leads were being repaired. What she had, and what nobody in that courtyard thought to notice, was a habit of watching animals before she approached them. She had learned this from her father, not because he was a trained animal handler, but because he had grown up on a farm before moving to the city, and his father had taught him that a frightened creature will always show you what frightens it before it shows you its teeth. Marin had grown up watching her father move slowly around nervous animals, reading the set of their ears, and the angle of their weight, and the speed of their breathing. She had bottle-fed 3 orphaned hunting pups in the back of his shop before she was 12. She had coaxed a half-wild goat down from a roof once, without anyone asking her to, simply because she was nearby and it seemed like the obvious thing to do. She had been watching the wolves since the day they arrived. Not closely, not from inside the pen. She had no authority to go near them, and would never have suggested such a thing to Corvin, who did not especially welcome suggestions from the junior staff. But the pen was visible from certain parts of the kennel yard, and during the minutes between her tasks, she had spent a great deal of time simply looking. She had noticed the same things she always noticed, the way the wolves positioned themselves in relation to each other when strangers approached, the way the black male always moved first, not to attack immediately, but to put himself between the visitors and the other two, the way the gray female mirrored whatever the male decided, a half step behind and to his right, the way a trusted partner follows a lead, and the youngest, the one with the hesitation in his step, always pressed slightly toward the back of the pen when the gate opened, not from fear exactly, but from pain. She was almost certain it was pain. His gait was too careful, too deliberate, in a way that young wolves, who are usually the most reckless, never chose on their own. She had also noticed something that had been sitting at the back of her mind for 2 weeks, without her quite having the shape of it yet. The wolves never moved against anyone the moment the gate opened. There was always a pause. They watched whoever came in. The trouble began only when the visitors started moving toward them, with tools in hand, leads and poles, and the long-handled implements that Corvin favored for working with large animals. The moment one of those things swung in their direction, the dynamic changed entirely. They were not attacking out of wildness. They were responding to something specific. She was still turning this thought over when she heard Corvin speaking to the king, and she heard the number 10. 10 days, and she heard the phrase that followed, put to rest, and something in her chest went very still. She was not a bold person by nature. She did not speak in large groups. She had never addressed the king directly, had barely been in the same courtyard as him on more than a handful of occasions. The proper thing, the expected thing, the thing every sensible part of her experience told her to do, was to pick up her water buckets and go back to work. She set the buckets down. She did not shout. She did not push through the crowd. She walked to the edge of the group still standing near Corvin and the king, and she said, clearly enough to be heard, that she would like to try. Several people turned to look at her. Corvin turned last, and when he saw who had spoken, the expression on his face moved through surprise and then settled somewhere near irritation. He asked her, without warmth, what exactly she thought she could offer. She said she was not sure yet, but she had been watching them, and she thought she understood something about what was frightening them. Faldrick looked at her for a moment. He had the kind of face that did not give away much, but his eyes moved over her in the way of a man who is genuinely evaluating something rather than dismissing it. He asked how long she had been in the kennels. She told him 2 years. He asked if she had worked with wolves before. She said no, only with hounds and once with a very stubborn goat, and she said it plainly, without trying to make it sound like more than it was. A few people near the edge of the crowd laughed briefly, not cruelly, just with surprise. Aldrich looked at Corvin. Corvin looked like a man trying to find a polite way to refuse on behalf of his king. Aldrich looked back at Marin. He told her she could try. He told her the same terms applied that applied to the official handlers. If the wolves drew blood, they would be destroyed that same day. He asked if she understood that. She said she did. He told her she had until the envoy arrived, the same deadline as Corvin, but that she would work separately and report only to him, not to Corvin, directly to him, at the end of each day. Corvin said nothing to this, but the look he aimed at the back of Marin's head as she walked toward the pen gate was not a look a person would ever want to receive. The gate opened. The gatekeeper, a solid young man named Will, who had been doing this job long enough to move fast when he needed to, swung it wide for her, and then stepped back and away. Marin stepped inside. She was carrying nothing except the coil of rope she had taken from her own peg on the way, the plain hemp rope she used every day, soft with use and light in her hands. The gate swung shut behind her. The 3 wolves were at the far end of the pen. All 3 had stopped moving. All 3 were looking at her. The black male, the one she had privately started calling Thorn because it suited the sharpness of his gaze, lowered his head slightly. It was not a bow. It was the beginning of a decision. Marin sat down on the ground. Not slowly, not hesitantly, not with ceremony. She simply bent her knees and sat in the dirt the way she might sit beside a fire, with her back against nothing and the rope loose across her lap, and she looked at the middle distance between herself and the wolves instead of directly at their eyes. She could feel the crowd at the gate behind her, the pressure of all those people watching, the held breath of it. She let it go. She had learned a long time ago from her father that the worst thing you could bring into a frightened animal's space was your own anxiety. They read it faster than they read anything else. She sat, she breathed, she waited. Thorn did not charge. He stood still for a long time, watching her with those pale yellow eyes. Then Vesper, the gray female, shifted her weight. Then Ash, the young one, took a single careful step forward and then stopped. The afternoon light moved across the pen floor. Somewhere beyond the gate, Marin heard the sound of someone walking away, then another person, then a third. The crowd was leaving. She stayed where she was. She was not waiting for them to come to her, not yet. She was simply being there, as consistently and quietly as possible, the way a tree is there, the way a stone is there, the way something becomes familiar before it becomes trusted. She had 2 weeks, she had all afternoon. She was not in a hurry. Across the pen, Ash lowered his head and sniffed the ground. Thorn watched her and did not move. Vesper looked between the 2 of them, reading the situation in the way that the wolves she had studied always did, checking the reactions of her packmates before settling on her own. Marin reached into the pocket of her work coat and took out a piece of dried meat she had brought from the kitchens. She set it on the ground in front of her knee, without looking at the wolves, without extending her hand toward them. She set it down the way you put something on a table, simply and without performance. Then she went back to looking at the middle distance. The sun moved. The pen was quiet, and for the first time in 6 weeks, no one in Aldenmore was carried out of it. The second day was colder. A thin wind moved through the gaps in the stone wall of the pen, and Marin had to add a second coat before she went in at first light. She brought bread that morning, her own breakfast, and she ate it sitting in the same spot she had chosen the day before, against the left wall, far enough from the wolves that they had space, but close enough that they could smell her easily. She had learned early that smell was the first language, faster than sound, and far more honest. Thorn was already awake when she came in. She could tell from the way he stood that he had been awake for some time, probably through most of the night, because that was what alphas in a distressed pack tended to do. They stayed alert so the others could rest. She did not look at him directly. She walked to her spot, settled into the dirt, and began eating her bread in unhurried bites. The gray female, Vesper, was lying along the back wall. Her head was up, and her ears were turned forward, tracking Marin's movements. But her body was still. That was progress, even if it was small. Yesterday, Vesper had stayed on her feet through the entire afternoon. The fact that she was lying down now meant she had made some kind of assessment in the night and had decided that whatever Marin represented, it was not the most urgent threat in the pen. Ash was harder to read. The youngest of the 3 was more unpredictable in the way that young animals in pain often are, swinging between moments of appearing normal and then stiffening up suddenly for no visible reason. Marin had spent a lot of her thoughts the previous night on Ash. She needed to get closer to him. Not today, but soon. She finished her bread and tucked the cloth it had been wrapped in back into her coat. Then she did something she had not done the day before. She began to talk. Not to the wolves specifically. Not in the coaxing voice that people sometimes used with animals, the high, bright tone that meant nothing, and was usually more about the speaker's comfort than the animals. She talked the way she talked to herself when she was working alone. A low, steady, meandering kind of speech that was more about the rhythm than the words. She talked about the morning. She talked about the wind. She said out loud that she thought the pen floor could use a proper sweep, but that she had not been given a broom yet and was not sure it was a good idea to bring one in anyway. Thorn moved. Not toward her. He paced 3 steps to the right and then stood still again, watching her with his head slightly tilted. It was the first voluntary movement he had made in her direction that was not a challenge. She kept talking, the same even tone, the same unhurried pace. By mid-morning, she had shifted close enough that Ash, who had drifted gradually nearer during the past 2 hours, without appearing to do so intentionally, was sitting approximately 4 body lengths away. She could see his rear leg clearly now from this distance. The fur along his lower right hip was matted and darker than the surrounding coat. That kind of matting happened when an animal licked a wound repeatedly. It was a sign of infection as much as injury, because healthy wounds did not demand that kind of constant attention. She did not move toward him. She let him be where he was, and continued talking softly to no one in particular. Around noon, Will slid the daily feed through the gap at the bottom of the gate, the large chunks of raw meat that the wolves received twice a day. Marin watched. Thorn went to the food first, as he always did. He ate a portion and then moved back. Vesper went next. Ash approached last, and when he put weight on his rear leg to lean down toward the meat, the small catch in his movement was unmistakable. He adjusted his stance, shifted his weight forward onto his front legs, and ate awkwardly, compensating for the pain in a way that was practiced enough to mean it had been going on for some time. No one had been close enough to notice this. That was the simple truth of it. 7 handlers had come into this pen over 6 weeks, and every single one of them had been focused on the animals as a whole, on the threat they represented, on the task of managing or restraining them. None of them had been sitting still long enough to simply look. That afternoon, she asked Will to bring her something from the palace stores. She made the request quietly, and Will, who was a decent and uncomplicated young man, with no particular investment in the politics of the situation, agreed without asking why. He came back with a small cloth pouch of dried herbs that the kennel physician used for cleaning minor wounds on the hunting dogs. She did not use it that day. On the 3rd morning, she arrived before dawn and sat in the dark and waited for the light. When it came, she found Ash was already closer to her starting position than he had been the day before, not by much, maybe 2 lengths. But she noticed it and filed it away as something that mattered. She had begun bringing extra food, not as a bribe, not something she held out and waved at the wolves, simply something she left near herself, a second portion of the kind of meat that was easiest for an animal with joint pain to chew. And she left it on the ground the way she had left the dried meat on the first day, plainly and without ceremony. Ash discovered it by mid-morning. He approached the food in a wide arc that kept him as far from Marin as the pen's width allowed, collected it, and retreated. She did not look at him while he did this. The 4th day, he took a smaller arc. The 5th day, he did not arc at all. He walked, still carefully, to the food beside her knee, and he ate it standing approximately 1 body length away, close enough that she could have reached out and touched him if she had been the kind of person who would have done that. She was not, yet she kept her hands in her lap and her eyes forward, and talked about whatever came to her, the weather, the smell of the morning, the way the stone walls of the pen caught the early light in a way that was almost pleasant. When Ash finished eating, he did not immediately retreat. He stood beside her for almost 10 seconds, his nose working at the air near her shoulder, and then he moved away at his own pace. Marin exhaled slowly and continued talking. It was on the 6th evening, as the light was going gold, and she was preparing to stand and leave for the night, that she noticed Thorn watching her from across the pen, in a way that was different from his usual measuring stare. He was not deciding whether she was a threat. She had watched him make that assessment long enough to know what it looked like. This was something else. He was curious. She stayed 5 minutes longer than she had planned, sitting in the dimming light, while Thorn stood and watched, and Vesper lay nearby with her ears relaxed, for the first time since Marin had started coming. Then Marin gathered herself and stood slowly, told the air around her that she would be back in the morning, and walked to the gate. "We'll let her out," he asked her, plainly and without sarcasm, how it was going. She thought about it for a moment. Then she said that she thought Ash had a wound that needed looking at, and she thought she might be able to get close enough in the next day or two to see it properly. Will looked at her for a moment and then said, in the tone of someone stating an observable fact, that she was the only person who had ever come out of that pen walking upright and carrying everything she came in with. She thanked him and went to make her report to the king. Aldrich listened to her in the small receiving room off the main hall, a practical room with a fire and 2 chairs and no ceremony, which was where he had chosen to hear her reports so that the conversation would not become a performance. He asked specific questions. She gave specific answers. He asked if she thought she could get close enough to treat Ash's wound. She said she thought so, but could not say when. He asked if she had changed anything about her approach since the first day. She said she had started bringing a rope. He looked at her. She explained that it was not for restraining them, it was just something familiar she held, something that kept her own hands occupied and settled, and that the wolves seemed to respond to the fact that she was never empty-handed without being visibly armed. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said that was interesting. He said it as though he meant it, not as a pleasantry. Then he dismissed her, and she walked back through the corridors toward the kennel quarters, past Corvin's office, past the senior handler's area, past all the people who watched her go by without saying anything. She was back in the pen at dawn the next morning with her rope and her bread and her steady, unhurried voice, and Ash walked straight to her without an arc at all. On the 7th day, when Ash came close, Marin reached out her hand and placed it gently on his side. He stiffened. She kept her hand still and kept talking. He exhaled. She moved her hand slowly toward his hip. What she found when her fingers parted the matted fur was exactly what she had been afraid of. Not a simple scrape or bruise, but a deep laceration, already closed over on the surface in the wrong way, the kind that seals before it heals and builds heat underneath. It was hot under her palm. Ash needed proper treatment, and he needed it within days rather than weeks. She stayed still and calm and kept her hand where it was, and Ash kept breathing, and across the pen Thorn watched everything with those pale yellow eyes and did not move. She left that evening with the cloth pouch of herbs in her pocket, still unused, and stopped at the gate to ask Will to send word to the palace physician's assistant, not the head physician, who had 12 other people to attend to and would want to make a production of the visit. The assistant, a quiet woman named Olive, who had been treating the kennel animals since before Marin arrived, and who had a practical, no-ceremony way of working that Marin respected. She knocked on the king's receiving room door and gave her report. She told him about Ash's wound directly and clearly, the way she had been learning to give information in this room, without softening it into something easier than it was. Aldrich asked how serious. She said, if it was not treated properly within a few days, it would become much worse, and a wolf with a serious infection would be more unpredictable, not less. Aldrich looked at the fire for a moment. Then he said to do what needed to be done. He said it as though he trusted her to figure out what that meant, which was, she had begun to realize, simply how he communicated. She went back to her mat that night and lay awake for a while, working through the next part in her head. Ash would let her touch the wound. She was fairly certain of that now. But treating it properly would require cleaning it, which would cause pain, and pain made even trusting animals unpredictable. She would need Thorn Calm for that. She would need Vesper Calm. She would need all 3 wolves in a state where a moment of unexpected pain from Ash would not cascade into something she could not manage alone. She lay in the dark and thought, and after a while, she picked up the rope from its peg above her head and turned it in her hands in the dark, feeling the familiar weight of it, and a thought arrived that she had not quite had before. She set up in the pen earlier than usual the next morning, before full light. She was sitting in the dirt with the rope loose across her knees when the sun came up and the light reached the wolves, and instead of simply holding the rope, she began, slowly, to swing one end of it in a wide, lazy circle beside her knee, just the end, a gentle arc through the dirt, back and forth. Thorn's head came up. Vesper's ears swiveled forward. Ash, already close, took 2 steps nearer and tilted his head. And then Thorn did something Marin had not expected. He walked across the pen, all the way across, and sat down 4 feet in front of her. Not crouching, not threatening, just sitting, the way a dog sits when it is waiting for something it recognizes. Marin kept swinging the rope and looked at him carefully. His head was slightly to one side, his tail swept the ground once, slowly, and stopped. She swung the rope in a different pattern, a figure shape, the way she sometimes did absently when walking the hounds. Thorn stood, shifted position, and sat again, this time slightly to her left. She went very still inside, though she kept her face and her breathing the same. She did not want to react. She did not want to move wrong. She made herself think clearly about what she was seeing. This wolf had done this before. He was not reacting to the rope randomly. He was responding to it in a specific way. A deliberate shift of position in response to a specific swing of the rope. This was trained behavior. Old Bram had used rope signals. The wolf was trying to show her that he knew how to follow them. She sat in the pen for 2 more hours, working through every slow swing and pattern she could think of, and with every one Thorn responded, and Vesper followed his lead, and Ash copied Vesper, and by the time she left to find Olive and bring her back, she knew that what she had in this pen was not 3 dangerous wolves. What she had was a well-trained pack with no one to speak their language, waiting for someone to pick up the rope. Olive came that afternoon, small and efficient and entirely unbothered by large animals. Marin introduced her by sitting beside Ash and placing her own hand on his back first, and then letting Olive kneel on his other side, while Marin held his attention with a slow rope movement. Thorn had shown her meant stay. Ash flinched once when Olive began cleaning the wound, and then leaned slightly into Marin's side and stayed still. It took 30 minutes. Thorn sat 4 feet away the entire time and did not move. Vesper lay down. When Olive rose and gathered her things and left, she said quietly to Marin that she had been treating animals in this palace for 9 years and had never sat inside that pen without a fence between her and the occupants. Marin said nothing to this, but filed it away alongside the other things she was gathering. The rope, the wound, the way Thorn moved when she changed the pattern. She was building a picture, and the picture was becoming clearer every hour. She just needed to make sure no one else interfered before the picture was complete. That evening, she came out of the pen and found Corvin standing near the gate with his arms folded and a look on his face that was different from irritation. It was something quieter and more deliberate than irritation. He watched her walk past and said nothing, and Marin walked to the king's receiving room and gave her report. And on the way back, she thought about that look and decided that she needed to pay attention to Corvin in a way she had not been paying attention before. There were 12 days left until the envoy arrived. Ash's wound was being treated. Thorn knew rope signals. Vesper was lying down when Marin was in the pen. Everything should have been moving toward resolution. Instead, that night, someone left a new long-handled whip hanging on the gate of the wolf pen. It was not there when Marin had gone in that morning. It was not any tool she recognized from the kennel stores. It was neatly coiled, freshly oiled, and left where the wolves would smell it through the gate all night. Marin took it down, carried it to her quarters, and pushed it under her mat. Then she lay awake until almost dawn, thinking about that look on Corvin's face, and the 12 days, and the 3 wolves on the other side of the wall, who had been waiting for months for someone to simply pick up a rope and remember they had a language. She was going to have to move faster than she had planned. She did not sleep more than 2 hours that night. When the sky began to lighten, she was already dressed and moving through the narrow kennel corridor, with her rope over her shoulder, and her mind working through the day's priorities in the order that mattered most. Ash first. The wound needed a second treatment, and Olive had said she would come again at midday if Marin sent word. Thorn second. More rope work, pushing further into the command patterns old Bram had built in, finding the edges of what the wolves remembered and what she could reach. And Corvin, always Corvin now, somewhere in the background of her thinking, like a problem she had not yet fully named. She had not told Aldrich about the whip. She was not sure why, except that telling him felt like handing the situation over to someone else to manage, and she was not ready to do that. This was her problem. She was the one inside the pen. She would deal with it. Thorn was waiting near the center of the enclosure when she came in, which was new. He had always been at the back or to the sides before, positioned to watch her arrival and decide. Now he was simply there, in the middle, turned toward the gate, as though he had known when she was coming. She walked past him to her usual spot along the left wall and sat down, and he turned and followed, settling 4 feet to her left, in the position she had started thinking of as his post. So it struck her, not for the first time, how completely his posture had changed. In the beginning, he had stood with his weight low and his head angled down, all the body language of a creature preparing to defend. Now he sat the way the palace hunting hounds sat when their handlers were working nearby, upright and easy, ears moving to track sounds rather than locked forward in threat assessment. Ash came next. His gait was already slightly better. Olive's cleaning had removed the infected material, and the swelling had begun to reduce. He still favored the leg, but no longer shifted his entire weight forward to compensate, which meant the deep ache was easing. He settled close to Marin's right side, closer than he had ever been without being prompted by food, and she let her hand rest lightly on his back while she began the rope work. She had spent the previous afternoon working through 16 different patterns with Thorn, and had by now mapped them in her head into rough categories. There were what she thought of as position signals, specific swings and loops that told the wolves where to move. There were attention signals, a figure movement, and a slow circle that seemed to mean something like watch and wait. And there were 2 signals she had not yet fully understood, one that made all 3 wolves press close together in a tight cluster, and one that made them drop flat to the ground simultaneously. Old Bram had built these patterns carefully, over years, and they were precise enough that small variations produced different responses. She had to learn them exactly. She worked for 3 hours that morning, slowly and methodically, and by the time the sun was high enough to warm the penstones, she could move all 3 wolves through a full sequence, from a scattered resting position into a tight formation, and then out again into individual positions, using nothing but the rope. She could make them hold and release and turn. She could, she realized, bring them to her side and hold them there with a single movement. This was not 3 wild animals. This was a working unit that had been running on no instructions since old Bram died somewhere on that ship in the sea between here and the Empire. They had been lost and frightened and grieving in the only way that pack animals grieve, by becoming defensive. And now, for the first time in months, someone was speaking to them in the right language and telling them what to do. She was thinking about all of this, sitting quietly while Ash rested his head on her knee, which he had never done before, and which she did not acknowledge in any visible way, because she did not want to startle him out of it, when she heard footsteps outside the gate. Not Will's footsteps. Will moved quietly, and with a certain deliberate evenness that she had grown familiar with. These were different, purposeful and heavy. Thorn heard them too. He was on his feet before the gate opened, weight shifting forward. It was Corvin. He did not enter the pen. He stood at the open gate with 2 of the senior handlers behind him and looked across at Marin and the wolves with an expression that she could not entirely read from a distance, but that contained, she was almost certain, something more than surprise. He had expected to find something different, either the wolves in the same state as before, or Marin on the ground. What he found was the 3 animals, arranged quietly around a kennel girl, sitting in the dirt with a rope in her hands, and the youngest one, with his head on her knee. Thorn had not moved further. He was watching the gate, but he had not advanced. Marin kept her hand on Ash's back and kept the rope moving in the slow circle that she had learned meant hold position. Corvin said, with careful neutrality, that he wanted to observe the progress she had made. She said, with equal care, that she would prefer he come back another time, because the wolves were still in early stages of building trust, and new visitors to the pen could disrupt the work. He said he had the authority to enter any enclosure on the palace grounds. He said it pleasantly. She said she understood that. She also said that if he came into the pen now and disrupted the work she had done, and the wolves reacted in a way that triggered the king's deadline, they would both have to explain to Aldrich why that had happened. She watched him weigh this. She watched the calculation move behind his eyes. He had been in this business long enough to know she was right about the disruption risk. He was also, she was increasingly certain, a man who was running his own calculation about what her success meant for him. If she managed the wolves, She would have done what his 14 years of experience and 7 handlers could not. That was a problem for Corvin that had nothing to do with the wolves. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said he would return the following morning, and that she should be prepared to demonstrate what the wolves could do. He said this to her, the way a senior person tells a junior person what will happen. A statement of decision, not a conversation. The gate closed. Thorn dropped back to sitting position. Vesper, who had stood when the gate opened, lay down again. Ash had not moved. Marin sat in the quiet pen and thought quickly and clearly. She had 10 days. Carvin was going to push for the demonstration before she was ready, or in conditions that were not ideal, or both. She needed to talk to Aldrich tonight, not just a report, a real conversation about what she had found and what she needed to protect. She also needed to find out whether the signal she had not fully mapped yet, the one that made the wolves press together, was a protection signal, or something else. Because if old Bram had built these wolves for royal use, for ceremonies and events, and the kind of public moments that imperial gifts were often intended for, then he would have included something for exactly that. A command for when there were crowds. A command for when things went wrong. She worked through it again in her head. She tried the press together signal while all 3 wolves were with her, and watched them move into formation around her, tight and deliberate, their bodies oriented outward like a ring. They were not pressing together for warmth or comfort. They were surrounding her. It was a protection formation. She sat inside the ring of wolves in the warm afternoon light of the pen and understood, fully and completely, what old Bram had built. He had built animals that could be commanded to protect a specific person, not attack, not threaten, not protect. All 3 animals were watching the walls now, outward, alert, positioned. She gave a small movement of the rope, and they held. She gave the release signal, and they drifted apart, and Ash put his head back on her knee. She needed to show this to Aldrich before Corvin showed him something else. She needed to make sure the king understood what was in this pen before anyone had a chance to misrepresent it. She sent word with Will that evening for an immediate meeting, not the usual end-of-day report, but an urgent one. Aldrich received her within the hour. She walked him through everything she had learned, the position signals, the attention commands, the protection formation, and she showed him with the rope in her hands, demonstrating each movement and explaining what old Bram had built and why it meant the wolves were not dangerous animals. They were trained ones, animals that had been without instruction and without the safety of someone they trusted, and who had been responding to the stress of that loss in the only way they knew. Aldrich listened without interrupting, which was a quality she had come to recognize as one of his more valuable ones. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what she needed from him. She told him 2 things. First, that Corvin's access to the pen should be restricted until the demonstration for the envoy, because any disruption now could undo weeks of work at a critical moment. Second, that she needed to know exactly what the envoy would expect to see so she could design the demonstration around what old Bram had actually built rather than trying to perform something the wolves had not been trained for. Aldrich considered both requests. Then he said he would limit Corvin's pen access to observation only, no entry, for the remaining days before the envoy arrived. He said he would also send a message to the envoy's ship, asking for a description of any ceremonies or demonstrations the Emperor had expected the wolves to perform. He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation strictly required. Then he said something she did not expect. He said that the Emperor's letter, which had been sitting in his correspondence since the wolves arrived, included a description of the keeper who had trained them, a man called Bram, who had died on the crossing. The letter described him as a person of no formal rank, a farmer's son from the western provinces of the Empire, who had come to the imperial kennels as a boy and spent 30 years there. Marin did not say anything. Aldrich said that Bram's method, according to the Emperor's letter, had been simple enough that the Emperor had felt the need to specifically mention it. Bram never used force. He always approached with a rope, because the rope was how he communicated. He had trained the wolves to follow rope signals from the age of 8 months, so that whoever eventually kept them would have a language ready to use. He paused. He said the Emperor's letter also noted that Bram had told him the animals would only fully respond to someone who came to them without fear and without weapons. Marin sat with this for a moment. Then she said that she thought she had been using Bram's rope, or one very much like it, because the patterns the wolves responded to were too specific to be coincidence. Aldrich nodded slowly. Then he said that might well be the case, and that he found it worth thinking about. She left that meeting with 8 days remaining and a clear path in front of her. She spent those 8 days in the pen from dawn to last light, pushing deeper into the command system old Bram had built, finding edges she had not yet reached, running the wolves through sequences that grew longer and more complex as the days went on. Ash's wound closed cleanly. Thorn began coming to her when she entered the pen rather than waiting. Vesper, who had been the most reserved, began bringing her things, rocks mostly, which she dropped at Marin's feet with the particular expression of an animal that is trying very hard to be useful. Corvin observed from outside the gate on 4 of those 8 days. He never came in. He stood with his arms folded and watched, and the look on his face had gone past quiet and deliberate into something that was harder to name. Once, on the 6th evening, she passed him in the corridor, and he told her that he hoped she understood she was making claims about these animals that she would have to prove in a very public setting. He said it carefully, the way someone constructs a sentence to mean more than one thing at once. She said she understood. She said it simply and kept walking. 3 days before the envoy arrived, Will knocked on her kennel room door in the evening and told her that 2 of the other handlers had been overheard saying that Corvin had been into the stores that afternoon, into the area where the training equipment was kept. Will said this with the careful neutrality of someone who is passing on information they think is important and leaving the interpretation to someone else. She thanked him and sat with it after he left. She could not know what Corvin had taken or why. She could not accuse him of anything she had not seen directly. What she could do was make sure that the day of the demonstration, she was in the pen early, she had checked everything herself, and she had told Aldrich in that evening's report exactly what Will had said. She did all 3 of these things. The envoy's ship arrived in the harbor 2 days later. His name was Loran, a tall, careful man in his 50s, with the particular poise of someone used to representing power, without being power himself. He came to the palace with a small retinue and was given the formal welcome and the large dinner and the night of rest. The demonstration was scheduled for the following morning in the main courtyard, which was larger than the pen and could hold the full court. That last night, Marin lay on her mat and did not sleep at all. She held her rope in the dark and went through every signal she knew, every pattern old Bram had built, every response she had mapped across 3 weeks of sitting in the dirt and learning to speak a language no one else had bothered to find. She thought about the protection formation and what it would look like in a full courtyard with the king and the envoy and the whole court watching. She thought about Thorn and the way he had looked at her on that first day, that pale yellow measuring stare, and the way he looked at her now when she came through the gate, the same eyes but different, warm in a way she had not expected a wolf's eyes to be capable of being warm. She thought about Ash and his healed leg, and the way he sometimes ran, fully and freely now, in the moments she gave the signals that meant the work was done and they could simply move. She thought about Vesper and her rocks. And she thought about what Corvin had gone into the stores for, and whether it would matter tomorrow, and decided that whatever it was, she would handle it the same way she had handled every other thing in this pen, by staying calm, by knowing her signals, by trusting the language old Bram had left behind for exactly this kind of moment. She was back at the pen gate before first light, 2 hours before the demonstration was scheduled. She checked the feed that would be given that morning before the trial, and found it immediately. It was not the normal feed. Something had been added, something that smelled faintly off, something that would not harm the wolves, but would unsettle them, make them edgy and reactive in exactly the way they had been in the first weeks. She left the feed where it was and found Will and told him what she had found and to bring the normal stores only, and to do it quickly and without making a scene. Will asked no questions. He moved. She entered the pen. All 3 wolves came to her. She worked through the full sequence twice, slowly and completely, ending with the protection formation. And then she released them and sat with them for the remaining time until the courtyard gates opened and the court began to fill. The guards at the gates were carrying long poles. She saw them from across the pen, and she felt Thorn's head swing toward them and his weight shift, and she gave the attention signal immediately, a quick snap of the rope, and Thorn's gaze came back to her. She gave the hold signal. He held. She walked to the center of the open courtyard with 3 royal werewolves at her heels. Lauren stood with Aldrich on the raised platform at the courtyard's far end. Around them, the court spread in a wide arc. Dozens of people in formal dress, watching. Marin was wearing her kennel coat. She had her rope in her left hand. She ran the sequence from the beginning. Position signals first, spreading all three wolves from their starting formation into a wide triangle, then pulling them back. Attention and hold. Individual positions. Thorn to the left, Vesper to the right, Ash straight ahead. The press together signal, and all three flowing around her into the protection ring, smooth and silent, with the efficiency of something that had been done 1,000 times. A sound went through the courtyard. Not a gasp exactly, something quieter than that. The sound of a large group of people realizing, all at once, that what they were seeing was not what they had expected to see. She ran it twice. Then she looked at Loran. He was watching with an expression that she could not read from a distance, still and intent, his head slightly forward. Then he said something to Aldrich she could not hear. Aldrich said something back. Lauren descended from the platform. He walked across the open courtyard toward her. Thorn watched him approach. Marin gave the hold signal and kept it. Lauren stopped 6 feet away. He looked at the wolves, and then at the rope in her hand, and then at her face. He asked, in accented but clear Aldenmore speech, where she had learned the rope signals. She said she had not been taught them. She had observed the wolves responding to rope movement, and worked out the patterns from watching their responses. He was quiet for a moment, then he said that Bram had built those signals over 7 years and had told the Emperor they were complex enough that no one would stumble upon them by accident. He said this not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact, delivered with what seemed like genuine puzzlement. She said she could not explain it. She said only that the wolves knew what they wanted to show her, and she had listened. Lauren looked at Thorn for a long moment. Thorn looked back at Lauren with those pale yellow eyes and did not move. Lauren said quietly that he had served in the imperial court for 22 years. He said that in all that time he had seen the wolves perform this sequence only 3 times, only for old Bram, and only after Bram had worked with them for more than 2 years. He said that the Emperor's letter had included instructions for what to do if no one in Aldenmore could manage them, because Bram himself had predicted it was possible. The instruction was to send them back. He looked at Marin. Then he looked back at the wolves. Then he did something she did not expect from a senior imperial envoy. He reached into his coat and brought out a folded piece of paper and handed it to her. It was worn at the edges, as though it had been carried for a long time. She unfolded it carefully. It was a diagram, hand-drawn, precise, with small, careful notations beside each figure. It was old Bram's rope signal chart, every pattern laid out in sequence with notes on each one, what it meant, what response it should produce, how to hold the rope for each movement. It was complete. It was everything she had already worked out, and several patterns she had not yet found. Lauren said that Bram had given this to him on the ship, the night before Bram died, and had told him to give it to whoever first managed to sit quietly in the pen long enough for the wolves to choose them. Bram's words, apparently, were that the wolves would know, and if anyone was waiting with patience and a rope, they would teach that person everything. Marin stood in the middle of the courtyard with the diagram in her hands, and all 3 wolves around her, and looked at the paper for a long time. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. She released the wolves from hold with the signal she had figured out herself, the small rolling movement of the rope end, and Ash immediately ran 3 wide circles around the courtyard, because he could, and Vesper trotted after him at her own pace, and Thorn pressed briefly against Marin's side, once, before following. The courtyard was very quiet. Aldrich descended from the platform. He walked across to where she stood, and he looked at the 3 wolves moving freely around his courtyard, and then at the kennel girl, who had figured out in 3 weeks what no one in his palace had managed in 6. He did not ask her how she had done it. He had already asked that in enough reports to understand the answer. Instead, he said, after a moment, that he believed some appointments needed to be reconsidered. He said Corvin would no longer be managing the royal kennels. He said Loran had indicated, in their conversation on the platform, that the Emperor would take considerable pleasure in knowing that the wolves had been received by someone who had understood them the way Bram had always hoped they would be understood. He said that Marin would be given the title of Royal Wolfkeeper, the quarters and resources and staff that came with the position, and the authority she needed to continue the work. She stood very still and let this settle. She asked what had happened with the feed. She had not mentioned it in the morning, and she mentioned it now because she thought it was important, and because she thought Corvin should be asked about it directly. Aldrich looked at her and said he had already heard from Will. She did not ask what would come of that. She thought she probably knew. She turned and looked at Thorn, who had completed a circuit of the courtyard and was coming back toward her with Vesper on his left and Ash, still running freely, looping in from the right. They came together near the center of the courtyard, and then came to her, all three, and settled around her in a loose cluster that was not the formal protection formation, but something less structured and more honest than that. She put her hand on Thorn's broad black head. He was still. Vesper pressed against her left leg. Ash sat on her foot, which was inconvenient given his size, but she said nothing about it. The court was watching. Loran was watching. Aldrich was watching. She thought about the first day, sitting in the dirt with the gate closed behind her, and 3 enormous wolves staring at her from across the pen. She thought about all the things people had brought into that space before she arrived. The force, the tools, the certainty that wildness had to be defeated rather than understood. She thought about her father, and the frightened goat on the roof, and the orphaned pups who had taken milk from her hand in the back of a butcher's shop before she had any idea what she would grow up to be. She had not tamed them. That was what everyone would say. She already knew it, the girl who tamed the royal werewolves. But it was not right, and she knew it would never quite sit right with her. She had found them. That was closer. She had found 3 lost creatures in a place that was not their home, missing the one person who had known their language, and she had sat down in the dirt and listened, and they had taught her everything she needed to know. The rope hung loose at her side. Ash leaned against her knee. Thorn raised his head and looked across the courtyard with that measuring gaze of his, and for the first time since Marin had known him, what she saw behind the measure was not wariness. It was something that looked, in its own wolf way, very much like relief. The new quarters were not ready until the following week. In the meantime, Marin slept in the same kennel room she had always used, on the same mat with the same peg above her head, and in the mornings, she walked to the pen the same way she always had. The difference was that when Will opened the gate now, all 3 wolves were already waiting near the entrance, and when she came through, they moved around her in the easy way of animals who know where they belong. Olive came every few days to check Ash's leg. It was fully healed within a fortnight, the fur growing back smoothly over the scar, and the first morning he ran without any hesitation at all. She stood at the pen wall and watched him, and felt something she did not have a precise word for, but that was warm and complete in the way that few things in her life had been. Loran stayed in Aldenmore for 2 more weeks before sailing back to the Empire. During that time, he met with her 3 times, not as a formal interview, but simply to talk, and he told her things about Bram that she found herself glad to know. Bram had been, by Loran's account, a quiet man who laughed easily, and who had believed, from first principles and without any academic support for the idea, that most animals that were labeled dangerous were simply misunderstood. He had said this often enough that the imperial court had found it mildly eccentric. He had spent 30 years proving it. Loran said, at their last meeting, that he would tell the emperor exactly what had happened here, and that the emperor would be very pleased to know the wolves had ended up with someone Bram would have approved of. He paused, and then added that he was fairly certain Bram would have recognized what she had done immediately, and would have said something like, "Of course, they always know." She thought about this after Loran left. She thought about the diagram in her pocket, folded and worn, and about the signals she now knew completely, and about the patterns that remained in the diagram that she had not yet tried, the ones at the bottom of the page with notations she was still working through. She thought about the fact that old Bram had handed this paper to Loran and asked him to give it to whoever came with patience and a rope, and she thought about the plain hemp rope on its peg in her old kennel room that she had picked up on her way to the pen that first morning, without quite knowing why. Bram had believed the wolves would know. She was becoming convinced he had been right. Corvin left the palace grounds quietly and without ceremony, 2 weeks after the demonstration. She did not see him go. She heard from Will that he had been offered a position, managing a smaller estate kennel in the south, and had accepted it, and that was the end of it. She did not feel much about this either way. She had learned that when you spend your energy on the living problem in front of you, you have less attention left over for everything else. And she had learned this from 3 wolves who had been doing exactly that for months. alive to what was present, and not much interested in what was not. The new kennel hands came in spring, 4 of them, assigned to work under her. They ranged from a boy of 16 who had grown up around horses to a woman of 30 who had previously worked in the palace stables and had an excellent practical mind. On their first morning, Marin brought them to the pen and let them stand outside the gate and look. They looked. She stood beside them and watched them see what she had seen on the first day. 3 enormous wolves pacing the interior, the black male with his pale eyes, the gray female with her watchful bearing, the young one moving freely now with no trace of a limp. She watched them take in the size and the presence of the animals and felt them recalibrate their expectations. Then she opened the gate and walked in. All 3 wolves came to her. Ash tried to sit on her foot again, which she had stopped actively preventing because there was no real winning that particular argument. Thorn pressed against her left side. Vesper dropped the rock she had been carrying, which was now a well-established habit, at Marin's feet. The 4 new hands stood at the gate and stared. She turned and looked at them and said, simply, that if they wanted to begin, they should come in and sit down. She handed the girl from the stables a coil of rope. She said it was not for restraining anything. She said it was for listening. She said the wolves would teach them what it meant if they were patient enough to let them. The girl from the stables looked at the rope and then at the wolves and then back at Marin. Marin said that the secret, if it could be called a secret, was that there was no force here, and there had never been. What was here was a language, a set of signals that a quiet man had spent 30 years building, and 3 animals that had been carrying that language with them across an ocean and through 6 weeks of fear and loss, waiting for someone to sit still long enough to hear it. She took her usual spot along the left wall and sat in the dirt. Thorn settled to her left. Vesper lay down on her right. Ash stayed near her knee. One by one, the 4 new hands came through the gate and sat down on the floor of the pen. In the morning light, with 3 royal werewolves looking at them with curious yellow eyes. No one charged, no one flinched. The wolves sniffed the air and made their assessments the way they always did. And in the quiet of that unhurried morning, the process that had begun on the day Marin walked in with nothing but a rope began again, patient and specific and entirely without force. Outside the pen, on the peg beside the gate where Marin had moved it from her old kennel room, the plain hemp rope hung in the morning light, worn smooth from years of use, no different from any other rope in any kennel in any kingdom. Ordinary in every way except for the things it had said, and the things it had heard, and the 3 lost animals who had been waiting all along for someone to finally pick it up.